In the serene town of Maplewood, nestled between lush forests and rolling hills, Emily Carter was the envy of many. At 32, she was not only beautiful, but also married to a successful tech entrepreneur, David Carter. Their lavish lifestyle, complete with a sprawling home and weekend getaways, painted the picture of a perfect life. Yet, beneath the polished surface lay cracks that would eventually lead to tragedy. Emily had always been the life of the party, her laughter infectious and her spirit vibrant. However, her marriage to David had begun to feel stifling. Though he was kind and devoted, David's long hours at work left Emily feeling isolated. Seeking solace, she found a new passion in yoga, signing up for classes at the local studio. It was there that she met Mark, a charismatic and handsome instructor whose magnetic presence captivated everyone around him. Mark was the embodiment of everything Emily felt she was missing: adventurous, free-spirited, and radiating a warmth that drew people in. As weeks turned into months, the two developed a close friendship, bonded over shared interests and a love for the outdoors. Their connection blossomed into something more intimate, as Emily found herself drawn to Mark's energy in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Despite her growing feelings, Emily struggled with guilt. She loved David, but the thrill of her secret relationship with Mark provided an escape from her mundane routine. She began to spend more time at the yoga studio, using classes as an excuse to meet Mark. The stolen moments filled her with excitement, but also deepened her inner conflict. One warm summer evening, after a particularly exhilarating yoga class, Mark invited Emily to join him for a hike. It was an invitation she could hardly refuse. As they wandered through the woods, surrounded by the sounds of nature, the tension between them reached a boiling point. Underneath the stars, they shared their first kiss, an electrifying moment that changed everything. As the weeks passed, Emily's dual life became increasingly complex. She juggled her time between David, who remained blissfully unaware, and Mark, who craved more of her attention. Their affair ignited a fire within her, making her feel alive and desired, but the guilt was ever present, a nagging reminder of the life she had chosen. One night, after an intimate evening with Mark, Emily returned home to find David waiting for her. He had prepared a romantic dinner, candlelight flickering across their dining table. As they sat together, David's earnest gaze made her heart ache. She couldn't shake the feeling that he sensed something was off. The evening unfolded in a haze of guilt and regret, with every laugh feeling like a betrayal. Over the next few weeks, Emily's anxiety mounted. She became adept at concealing her affair, but the pressure was overwhelming. Mark urged her to leave David, promising her a life of adventure and passion. The idea of escaping her responsibilities tempted Emily, but the thought of hurting David was unbearable. Then, one fateful evening, everything spiraled out of control. Emily received a text from Mark, suggesting they meet at the studio after hours. They could be together without the risk of being seen. Excitement coursed through her veins, and she agreed. Little did she know, that decision would change her life forever. As she arrived at the studio, the atmosphere felt electric. Mark was waiting, his eyes glimmering with anticipation. They embraced, and their passion ignited once more. However, as the night wore on, a shadow loomed over their stolen moments. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It felt wrong, like fate was conspiring against her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with a message. It was David. He was concerned about her whereabouts, having tried to call several times. Panic surged through Emily. She quickly explained that she was at a late meeting for a project at work, but David's tone felt unsettling. Something was off, and her heart raced as she glanced at Mark. "Maybe we should call it a night," she suggested. Her voice tinged with apprehension. Mark frowned, pulling her closer. "Come on, Emily, just a little longer. You know we belong together." In that moment, torn between loyalty and desire, Emily made a choice. She kissed Mark one last time, then rushed out of the studio. As she stepped into the cool night air, a wave of guilt washed over her. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were about to unfold. That night, as Emily lay in bed next to David, sleep eluded her. The weight of her choices pressed down like a heavy blanket. She could feel David's warmth beside her, but it offered little comfort. Unbeknownst to her, the events set in motion that evening would lead to a shocking confrontation, one that would culminate in violence, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. The following days were a blur of tension and secrecy for Emily. Mark became increasingly insistent that she leave David, urging her to take a leap of faith and start a new life with him. Emily, torn between the comfort of her stable marriage and the intoxicating thrill of her affair, felt trapped in a web of her own making. One evening, after another argument with Mark about their future, Emily decided to put an end to the affair. She called Mark and asked him to meet her at the yoga studio for one final conversation. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had to take control of her life before things spiraled further out of hand. The night was unusually quiet as Emily arrived at the studio. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Mark was already there, pacing back and forth. As soon as he saw her, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and desperation. "Emily, you came," he said, his voice filled with hope. "I knew you'd choose us." She shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "Mark, we need to stop this. I can't keep lying to David. This has to end." Mark's expression darkened. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean? You're not serious, are you? After everything we've been through?" "I am serious," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't do this anymore. I love you, but I can't leave David. It's over." Mark's face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You're just going to walk away after all those promises? You're choosing him over me?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mark. I have to go." She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her back forcefully. His grip was tight, his eyes wild with rage. "No, you're not going anywhere," he hissed. "You can't just use me and then throw me away like this." Fear gripped Emily as she struggled to free herself. "Mark, let go. You're hurting me." But Mark didn't release her. Instead, he shoved her against the wall, his face inches from hers. "You think you can just end things like that? After everything I've done for you?" Emily's heart raced as she realized how dangerous the situation had become. She had never seen Mark like this before, and the intensity of his anger terrified her. "Please, Mark," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Just let me go." But Mark was beyond reason. His mind was consumed with thoughts of betrayal and rejection. All the emotions he had kept bottled up exploded in that moment. "If I can't have you," he muttered, his voice low and menacing, "then no one can." In one swift motion, he grabbed a heavy yoga block from a nearby shelf and swung it at Emily. The force of the blow sent her crashing to the floor, her vision blurring as pain shot through her head. Emily lay on the cold wooden floor, gasping for breath. She could feel the blood trickling down her forehead, but her mind was in a haze. She tried to push herself up, but Mark was on her in an instant, pinning her down. "You think you can leave me?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty studio. "You think you can just walk away?" Panic surged through Emily as she struggled against him, but he was too strong. She could see the madness in his eyes, and she knew she had to do something before it was too late. With all the strength she could muster, Emily managed to free one of her arms and clawed at his face. Mark recoiled in pain, giving her just enough time to scramble to her feet. She stumbled toward the door, her vision swimming, but Mark caught her before she could reach it. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. Emily screamed in pain, the sound piercing through the silence of the studio. She fought desperately, kicking and flailing, but Mark was relentless. In a fit of rage, he threw her to the ground again, her head hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Emily's world spun as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. She tried to crawl away, but her body felt heavy, unresponsive. Mark loomed over her, his breath ragged. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of anger and sorrow. "I loved you, Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do this to me?" With a final, agonizing effort, Emily tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her strength was fading, and she could feel herself slipping away. The last thing she saw was Mark, tears streaming down his face as he knelt beside her, his hands trembling. Then, everything went black. Emily's body lay motionless on the studio floor, a stark contrast to the peaceful, serene space where people usually sought solace. Mark, his chest heaving with each breath, stared at her lifeless form, a mix of disbelief and horror washing over him. The reality of what he had just done hit him like a tidal wave, and he staggered back, his hands shaking. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unable to process the gravity of his actions. The studio was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic pounding of his own heartbeat. Mark's mind raced as he struggled to make sense of the chaos that had erupted in a matter of minutes. Panic set in as he glanced around the room, his eyes darting to the door and then back to Emily. He knew he had to act quickly. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear. He had to cover his tracks. Leaving Emily's body, there was not an option. He had to make it look like an accident, or at the very least, ensure that no one suspected him. Mark crouched beside Emily, his hands trembling as he carefully lifted her. She felt so fragile, so much smaller in death than she had in life. He carried her to the back of the studio, where a small utility closet stood half open. With a shaking hand, he pushed the door wide and gently laid her down inside, her body slumping lifelessly against the brooms and cleaning supplies. His heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed a towel and hastily wiped down the floor, removing any traces of blood. He wiped his own hands, still sticky with Emily's blood, his mind racing. He had to think, to plan. He couldn't afford any mistakes. After he had cleaned up as best he could, Mark took a deep breath and stepped back, surveying his work. The studio looked almost normal, as if nothing had happened. But he knew that wasn't enough. He needed an alibi. He needed to make sure no one could place him there at the time of her death. Frantically, he checked his phone. It was just past 10 p.m. He had a window of time before the studio's security cameras reset. He needed to leave now, before anyone noticed he was still there. He sent a quick text to a friend, casually suggesting they meet for a late-night drink, something he often did. It would help establish his presence elsewhere. With one last glance at the utility closet, Mark left the studio, the door clicking shut behind him. He hurried to his car, his heart racing, and drove off into the night, his mind spinning with fear and regret. He had to keep his cool. He had to act normal. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Emily lying lifeless on the floor, her eyes closed, her body broken. It haunted him, taunted him, even as he sat at the bar with his friend, forcing himself to laugh and chat as if nothing was wrong. Every word felt hollow, every smile fake. He was a ghost, walking through a world that suddenly felt unreal. The next morning, the yoga studio's owner arrived to open up for the first class of the day. As she unlocked the door, she noticed the faint scent of bleach lingering in the air. Frowning, she walked inside, her eyes scanning the room. Everything seemed in order, but something felt off. It wasn't until she walked to the back and saw the utility closet door slightly ajar that a sense of dread washed over her. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open. The scream that echoed through the studio was piercing, shattering the morning calm. Emily's body, crumpled and cold, lay hidden among the cleaning supplies, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Within minutes, the police were swarming the studio, yellow tape cordoning off the area as detectives and forensics scoured the scene for clues. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Mark. His erratic behavior, coupled with the traces of his DNA found on Emily's body, painted a clear picture. The text messages between them, the obsessive calls, the security footage showing him leaving the studio late that night, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Mark was arrested 3 days later, his face pale and drawn as he was led away in handcuffs. The once charismatic yoga instructor was now a broken man, his life shattered in an instant of rage and jealousy. During his trial, the details of the affair and the violent confrontation that led to Emily's death were laid bare for all to see. The jury deliberated for less than 2 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the courtroom emptied, Emily's family sat in silence, the weight of their loss pressing down on them. No sentence could bring her back. No punishment could erase the pain. They could only hope that, in time, the memory of her laughter, her kindness, would overshadow the horror of her final moments. And as for Mark, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the ghost of the woman he had loved and lost in a moment of blind, senseless rage.